The first topic I want to talk about, I'm going to call why Bill Gates is a much better energy thinker than Elon Musk. So, to give you some of the context, my friend and colleague Eric Dennis sent me a month or so ago, maybe, a link to a video that Bill Gates, which was of Bill Gates getting interviewed at Stanford University on the general topic of energy innovation. And there was a particular clip, and I was so excited by this clip because Gates said something that I think it's fundamentally almost obvious, but it's almost nobody is talking about it. It has to do with the fundamental problems with intermittent fuel sources, namely solar power and wind power. And part of my context here is that in researching the new version of the moral case for fossil fuels, I've been looking at, okay, what is the current state of intermittent power? Are there fundamental improvements that I should be aware of? Have storage problems been solved? And just the more I think about it and look into it, the more the same fundamental problems are still there. And yet what's happening is that people are just talking themselves into all sorts of, I don't know, they just have these, they're somehow trying to persuade themselves that it's a really good idea to try to rely on the sun and the wind with everything we know about how intermittent they are, about how infrequently they're available, about all the places they're not available. There's just these general things of, oh yeah, we'll just have storage. And it's in this very vague and abstract way. And just my own thinking has been, this thinking is horrible. And I had my own way of thinking about it, which I'll share a little bit, but it was really cool to hear Gates just talk in a straight way about this. And I'll quote him in a second, but I should say Bill Gates definitely has a much more negative view of carbon dioxide than I do. That is, he is much, much more concerned than I am that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere rising are an existential crisis that are worth devoting a lot of resources to lessen. But what I really appreciate about him is he is looking at it from a human perspective, and I would call it a human flourishing perspective. And part of the evidence of that is that he's really looking at it from the perspective of what are cost-effective ways that we can lower CO2 levels, or at least initially lower CO2 emissions that are going to have a minimal negative impact on people's lives. And he's got this recognition that energy has a fundamentally positive impact on people's lives. And for somebody who comes from software, this is pretty impressive, just that he recognizes in such a deep way that access to abundant energy, I would call it, that's the technology that powers every other technology, that makes everything, that amplifies every human capability, makes every aspect of human flourishing better. And he really recognizes this. And therefore, he's very, very focused from the perspective of CO2 reduction on how do we find a form of power that can reliably get us cheap, plentiful energy. And he's really focused on that. And in part because of that focus, he is really, really suspicious of these proposals for intermittent power. And he's very, very pro using nuclear power, as am I, whether CO2 is an issue or not. I'm very, very pro liberating or decriminalizing that form of power. So here's the section. The interviewer says, so a lot of people are very optimistic, as you know, with wind and solar. The renewables costs are coming down. The battery costs are coming down. You think that's enough? And then Bill Gates jumps in quickly and says, no, that is so disappointing. I mean, really, Vaclav, and he's referring to Vaclav Smil, who's an energy guru. Vaclav yesterday, he said, okay, here's Tokyo, 27 million people. You have 3 days of a cyclone basically every year. It's 22 gigawatts rates over 3 days. Tell me what battery solution is going to sit there and provide that power. I mean, let's not joke around. You're multiple orders of magnitude, $100 per kilowatt hour. That's nothing. That doesn't solve the reliability problem. And then he adds, and remember, electricity is 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. Whenever we came up with this term clean energy, I think it screwed up people's minds because now they don't understand. And I'll read a little bit more. I was at this conference in New York. I won't name it. And all these financial guys got on stage and said, oh, we're going to rate companies in terms of their CO2 output. And we're going to say this company puts out a lot of CO2 and financial markets are magical. And all of a sudden the CO2 will stop being emitted. And I was like, okay, how are you going to make steel? You guys on Wall Street, do you have something in your desks that makes steel? What? Where's the fertilizer? Cement, plastic? Where's it going to come from? Do planes fly through the sky because of some number you put on a spreadsheet? So the badness of this so-called finance is the solution. I just don't get that. There is no substitute for how the industrial economy runs today. And the paradigmatic country is India. Will India pay a premium price to have materials to build buildings to get rid of slums? Will they pay a premium price for air conditioning? Basically, the answer is no. The voters there won't, and they probably shouldn't deny themselves when their greenhouse gas emissions per person is only a 20th of what the US has already emitted. So there's a lot there. First thing I want to point out is just him recognizing how fundamental energy is to human flourishing. And notice how rare this is, even among energy gurus. I mean, for example, Elon Musk is a sort of energy guru, but his entire focus is let's not use fossil fuels and let's use solar. But it's all about what's wrong with energy as we use it. And it's not at all about what's right about energy's impact on life. And if you don't value the energy's impact on life, then you're not going to value the attributes of being cheap, plentiful, and reliable. And then this gets to Gates's other point, which is just so obvious, but nobody says it. So he just gives this example of you have a situation in Tokyo, but this occurs all kinds of places where for 3 days you have conditions where solar and wind, so these intermittent fuels, won't generate reliable energy. So they won't be a reliable fuel source. They won't even provide anything. And so then the question is, okay, where are you going to get power from during those days? And the fundamental option is you need some continuous fuel source. You always need a continuous fuel source. So anytime you have an intermittent fuel source like solar and wind, it always needs life support from a continuous fuel source. Now, one continuous fuel source, and by far the most popular, is some form of fossil fuel solution, because that's a naturally stored form of energy that's relatively cheap to use, and so it can provide life support. But the problem is, not only are you still relying on the continuous fuel, that's not even the half of it. It's that you are using the continuous fuel source very inefficiently, because with the way continuous fuel sources work is the efficient way to use them tends to be in a relatively stable way, just like driving your car at 55 miles an hour. That's going to get you really good fuel economy, whereas stop and go traffic gets you horrible fuel economy. And so what you're doing is, it's not just that the intermittent sources are dependent on the reliable sources, they're dependent on the extremely inefficient use of the reliable sources. So it's wrong to think of these intermittent sources as sources of energy themselves. They always need to be thought of as part of a process, and that process involves inefficiently using the reliable forms of energy. So it's a lot like using it's a lot like if you say, well, we want to, let's just say Apple said, hey, we want to be politically correct, and therefore and San Francisco has a homeless problem, therefore we're gonna have homeless people, we're gonna have as much of our let's say packaging done by homeless people as possible. And sure, they don't come in reliably, we don't know when they're going to come, but we've got a certain rate for them, and so we're going to somehow say that they're cheaper. But you can't just look at the cost of the homeless people, you have to look at the cost of the whole process that's actually going to manufacture your product. And in this case, they need constant life support from reliable people. and the reliable people doing the packaging or anything else, it's going to make them a lot less efficient to have to continually be working with these unreliable people. And this is very analogous to how energy works. Now, the counter to this, which turns out to be even more crazy, that Gates is really getting at, is storage. So people will say, oh, well, just storage. That's fine, just storage. And what Gates is doing that almost nobody else does is he's actually thinking of this in a realistic way. So I said that the intermittent source depends on a continuous fuel source. So that can be a naturally stored fuel like fossil fuels or nuclear, or it can be a continuous fuel source that man creates in the form of a charged battery. But that turns out to be super, super hard. And he takes this example: if you have this 3-day cyclone where the intermittent things don't work, that means you have to build a continuous fuel source that can provide energy for days and days and days, but that's almost never going to be used. It's almost never going to be used that much. You need it a few days a year to do that, but then most of the time you don't need that much storage. And Gates elsewhere in the interview says, so what's your efficiency per kilowatt hour on that? The idea is, if you have to completely massively overbuild this huge storage system just so that you can handle these extreme cases that will definitely happen and definitely need to be handled, then you just need to have this dramatically overbuilt system. And then you have to pay a huge amount of money for something that's almost never going to be used. So it's also a hugely inefficient system. So one form of using intermittent sources is you're using fossil fuels or nuclear in a hugely inefficient way. But the other form is to use batteries in a hugely inefficient way. And this is why these intermittent sources always end up increasing the price on the grid. So that's my take. And what's notable is just that Gates is honest about this, and then nobody else talks about this. I'm just curious, Stefan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, what I really liked about this is that Bill Gates starts with recognizing the dimension of the problem, which is huge. So we are talking about having over 80% of the of world energy replaced as of today, and he really thinks about how to make this happen. And so why he's involved in nuclear is because he recognizes that some huge innovation has to take place to make that happen, while taking into account that the humans of the future will likely use more energy. So we want to get more prosperous. A lot of humans on the planet right now don't have remotely the amount of energy that you and I are enjoying. And so when you look at something like the IPCC reports, they are just focusing on these renewables, and at the same time they claim to be focused on something like this sustainable development goals as well. So, bringing people out of poverty, bringing electricity to people in rural areas in Africa and Asia, and so on. And he recognized that this is a huge problem. You can't just say, oh, we just have this alternative now, which is something that you hear a lot from the climate activists today, and also from academia and the IPCC reports recently. And I really like the thinking of first recognizing the reality of what do we have, what's the technological possibility, and what needs to happen. So he's allocating money with his foundation to an innovative solution to that. That's a real solution. So if you care about CO2 and you believe that this is a catastrophe and the only way to deal with it is reducing the emission of CO2, then you need a really, really big solution to this problem of energy.
And I mean, you definitely should not be ruling out the obvious best way of doing it that we know of, which is nuclear fission. Don, anything occur to you when following the story?
I mean, the only thing is I really want to underscore the point that you've stressed about energy as a process, because as somebody who reads the news, I'm constantly bombarded with all of these different claims and studies that, solar and wind are or are about to be cheaper. And if you look at them, inevitably what's going on is that they're not considering the whole process. And, each study will leave out different things or make different sorts of assumptions. But at the end of the day, it's not taking seriously that what we're concerned with is the actual usable energy and the affordability of that energy, and instead slicing off a bit of the process in order to sell something that they're biased in support of.
And so one thing that's come up when working on Moral Case for Fossil Fuels 2.0 is just giving readers an even better framework for processing, no pun intended, these claims that they hear. And one just mandate that I think we should have in our minds all the time is always seek the full context. And there are a lot of dimensions of that, but one is when you're looking at energy, look at the full process, and that includes looking at the costs, in this case the economic costs of the full process. So when somebody just says, "Oh, solar panels are cheaper, therefore we should have 100% solar," just think a little bit about, well, does that really describe the whole process? And if you start looking at most energy reporting this way, you'll just quickly discover that it's either dishonest or incompetent, and therefore useless. And then you'll probably stop reading most of the energy news, which I think is a good idea generally, and then try to look at more enduring sources. All right, so that's the Gates story, or at least part of that, and definitely one other thing I thought of in comparison to Elon Musk. I mentioned how Musk doesn't sufficiently value energy when he talks, but I think the even bigger thing is that Musk often has a really good way of thinking that he describes as thinking in first principles, and I think is probably better described as thinking in fundamentals, which is he actually never carefully defines it, which is its own problem. But the idea is that in any context, he's looking at what are the fundamental drivers of an outcome. And if he's looking at cost, he looks at, okay, what are the fundamental drivers of, say, there's a story in the biography of him, like Elon Musk and the Quest for a Fantastic Future. There's a story about how he thinks about aluminum. And I haven't validated the details, but it makes sense schematically. And there was the cost of generating an all aluminum body, and it was considered prohibitive. But when he looked at the fundamental inputs, he saw, well, actually, this shouldn't be prohibitive. There's no law of physics that says that this is going to be prohibitive, but the current practice is uneconomic, but there are obvious opportunities to improve the current practice. So that's a good example of he's thinking in terms of the fundamentals of it. He's not just looking at convention and what convention makes possible. But then if you're going to think about the fundamentals of solar, you need to think about the fundamental problem or challenge with intermittent fuel sources, which is that they always require life support from continuous fuel sources, and that they require the inefficient use of those continuous fuel sources. So you have to factor that in. And Musk never even addresses that in any kind of serious way. And thus, when he's promoting solar and even batteries, it's dramatically parasitical on the life support that's made possible by the fuel sources that he's opposing. So I would love to have a first principles discussion with Elon Musk about many things, but certainly about the drivers of the price of actual reliable energy delivered to the consumer, and get him to grapple with these things, because I don't think he's living up to his own standards in this context.